welcome to you all. I'm very excited to have you here. I'm Ed Moyle. We're going to be talking about a topic near and dear to my heart today. So I've been a security practitioner for 25 years, focusing on kind of the application security space, and seen a lot of changes over the years in terms of specific development models and so on. So I'm just really excited to talk about it. I'm currently a partner with Security Curve, but really excited to be here. Joseph?
Thanks, Ed. Yeah, Joe Saunders from Run Safe Security. Very much looking forward to the discussion. I know we've got both some interesting data and some great additional panel members. So I very much look forward. Run Safe immunizes software. We like to say we do it without developer friction, and so we can enable continuous delivery of software. And so very much look forward to the discussion, Ed, and I think we've got, you've done a great job to kind of set up the content. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Anders?
Hello, good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, whatever it happens to be. I'm Anders Wahlgren, VP of Technology Strategy at CloudBees. I joined CloudBees a little over a year ago when Electric Cloud, my former company, was acquired. I was the Chief Technology Officer at Electric Cloud for about 15 years before that. So I've been working with our customers and the community in general on DevOps and how to do software securely and make the secure way, the easy way, the right way, the default way, those sorts of things. So this is absolutely a topic near and dear to my heart, as I suspect it is for most of us.
Great, thank you. Cindy?
Hi, I'm Cindy Blake, Senior Security Evangelist with GitLab. You may not think of GitLab as a security company, but we have an end-to-end platform for DevOps. And as part of that, we've baked security into the CI process. So I'm very passionate about application security and enabling the developers to find and fix vulnerabilities much earlier in the life cycle. And I think by making joining together one tool and one workflow, that is very achievable. So I'm excited to be part of this discussion today. Thank you.
Yeah, really looking forward to it. Thank you. Stephen?
Hey, so I'm Stephen Shin, and I run the developer relations team at JFrog. And really pleased to be joining the panel. I'm excited about this topic because I've been doing DevOps for over a decade and been doing Java and language hacking. So I've got my favorite cup with all the different languages on it. This was from a GeekCon conference years ago. Unfortunately, we're not getting to a lot of in-person events these days, but I'm hoping we get it back soon. I joined JFrog last year, and then we have awesome products for binary management, for binary security, and I'm happy to be the voice of the developer on this podcast and panel.
Great. Well, thank you. So in terms of getting started, I think I think a good way to start would be let's talk a little bit about kind of what's brought us all here today, right? So a lot of folks, I think everybody maybe brought up the elephant in the room, right? DevOps in their introduction. But I guess when we're talking about high velocity code release, let's kind of just make sure that we're all on the same page. So is that, is it DevOps specifically, or is there like some magic period of time? Like, if you have an agile process, for example, is there some, magical, sprint, short enough sprint that it becomes a high velocity code release there too? And, just to start us off, why don't we just, whoever has an opinion, let's start with that. Actually, maybe
we
Cindy.
Probably all have opinions.
Well, let's maybe start with Cindy, because I think she's got a unique viewpoint by virtue of the GitLab piece.
Yeah, sure. It's all about delivering results faster. So breaking code into a small enough change that it can have an impact on the business. And so I think that determines the velocity more than anything. And so for one business, that velocity may be, monthly. For another, it may be daily or hourly. It really depends upon the business in terms of what is, a rapid velocity. But when you think about pushing code out and delivering it in that sort of iterative fashion, it really changes the way you look at applying your application security to that.
Mhm. So yeah, no, that makes sense. So it's really kind of more the, it's less about DevOps specifically and more about kind of once you've reached kind of that point of being able to push code into release much faster. So that makes sense. So let's talk about some of the challenges that are out there. I mean, and maybe Stephen, you said you were doing this for a long time. Can you give us a flavor for kind of what are some of the challenges associated with the high velocity code release?
Yeah, so I think it helps, just as Cindy was talking about, to explain first of all why we're all doing high velocity code releases. And there's really two main reasons for it, right? So one is we have all these users who, they're kind of annoying. They want new features and they want them now, and they've actually gotten really badly trained because our friends at Apple and Samsung and all the companies which are pushing out high speed delivery to like Google Play Store and the Apple Store have trained users to expect that they should get new features and they should get them now and they should get continual updates. And the second thing, the big thing, is security. It's not okay anymore to have releases. We were talking about release speed, releases every 6 months, every month, even every week. You're leaving yourself vulnerable if there's a 0 day. So even as developers, there's a big push and focus on continuous updates and continuous delivery because the market demands it. I mean, it's the only way which you can keep a secure platform and also continuously deliver the features and the benefits for our users. And I've been doing Agile for a really long time. Started with extreme programming. Ron Jeffries was my mentor. He's an awesome guy. And really, those core tenets about how you release software quickly, how you break down walls and get collaboration between development, between QA, and now between operations with DevOps and all the cloud native advances. This is really the standard practice for development. And some folks are farther along on the curve, and hopefully through this conversation, we can help other folks to kind of raise their level.
Yeah, you said something really interesting there, which I want to kind of delve into a little bit, right? Which is, you were talking about kind of, the overall maturity piece, right? Which I want to explore that a little bit if we could, and maybe, so two things, right? The maturity side, but then also kind of the overall, like how fast is fast, right? So for example, like, you might have Amazon that's doing, production code pushes, every couple of minutes, right? Or faster than that in some cases. Or, you might have a DevOps pipeline that, where the releases are not quite at that pace. So can we talk a little bit about like how prevalent is this? Is this something that, is every company is in this boat, or is it, really kind of, focused on like a core subset? And Anders, why don't we talk to you about that? So the data suggests that this is a lot of folks. Does that jive with with the experience that you're seeing as well?
Well, I mean, there's multiple ways of kind of looking at that. For sure, every software company has this issue, right? I mean, security, is something that's just fundamental to what we do, and getting even more important as the types of information that we put into these systems get more personal, healthcare, finance, all of those things. Security to me is it's part of quality, and I think as with quality, it is a measurement problem, right? And so the frequency of measurement and the depth of measurement that you do matters, and the different kinds of measurements and where you do them. So you need to keep track of how early in the process, in my pipeline, if you will, can I start applying kind of security things, whether they're scans or dynamic static analysis, those sorts of things. How do I treat my software supply chain and know that the incoming third party or open source things I'm using are in fact the things that I believe that they are. And how do I continue to do that then after I'm in production? Because, as I think, most of us know, most of the exploited vulnerabilities, in fact, I would say probably by far the vast majority, are old, well-known vulnerabilities that just happen to still be in production, and people haven't fixed them. So, we all operate at different cadences. We all have different processes that we run, whether we're, hardcore, DevOps all in, or whether we're sort of doing, Scrum, fall, water stuff. And I think most companies fall in between. Most companies are not quite as far along on the maturity curve as I think we would like to believe inside the community, because, when we go to our conferences and those things, we're all talking to each other, and we're a small subset of all the people in the world who write and release software. And there's a ton of organizations out there that are not quite as far along yet. And that's really where the challenge is for the industry going forward, is to make these things more accessible, easier, and better. And that, I think that's why we're all here, right? Is to sort of spread that word and to talk about that.
Yeah, so I'm interested, and so I really kind of want to pivot us fairly quickly off of, so I think we've done a good job as a group, kind of level setting, where kind of the industry is, right? So, talking about the emergence of these challenges, right? But this point keeps coming back up, and it's very germane to security, and so I want to explore that a little bit, right? Which is that, one of the things that you'll notice that this is, the title of this session is the benefits and challenges, right? So there's security benefits and also security challenges, but it strikes me from things that that you've said and that both things that everybody said, actually, that kind of the real difference between whether it's a security benefit or if it's a security challenge comes back to this question of overall maturity of process. So, I mean, what is the overall state of the health of of DevOps and more generally, high velocity code in the industry? Maybe I want to get Cindy's take on this, and Stephen also brought up the point earlier, so I want to get his take too. So maybe let's start with Cindy and then go to Stephen.
I think the industry's starting to recognize that you really need to empower the developer. There will always be more developers than there are security people. So if you can empower the developer to find and fix vulnerabilities, then it's going to be less expensive. There was the NIST study from, 10 or 15 years ago now, that showed, you want to shift left because it's less expensive to find and fix things early. So that, has been a continued driver. The challenge is how you do that, and it hasn't been easy. Application security just by itself is a hard thing to do, because it's not just popping a WAF in a network and tuning it a bit, right? It's people, processes, and technology that all have to come together. So there's a collaboration effort, there's the tooling effort, and from a state of the industry, a lot of people have tried to take traditional application security tools and pull them into the DevOps pipeline, into the CI pipeline, if you will, for the developer. But it's a little bit kludgy, because it's usually those come in as comments, they're not actionable. What you really need is to think out of the box and put your developer as the first security user. So enable them to find these things within their native workflow and make it actionable, where they can easily do the remediation right there before it ever leaves their hands. And then at the same time, also give the security team the visibility and the tools that they need. But think first about, how can I eliminate those vulnerabilities right up front, before the code is ever merged with anybody else's and makes it into a test environment.
So I do want to go. So thank you for that. I think that's insightful, and I do want to go to Stephen on the same question. But Stephen, if you'll indulge me, I want to put a little spin on it, just based on what Cindy said. So it sounds like this trap that people fall into of trying to fold in traditional security tools into their DevOps pipeline. it sounds like there's something there. One thing that strikes me, right, is the canonical answer for a lot of, as a developer, longtime developer, right? I always hate this, right? Which is that security people are always trying to educate me on how to do secure coding. It's like, I don't need you to tell me not to use stir copy, thanks. But like, that's almost the canonical answer. But it sounds like in a DevOps shop, maybe that's not even an option, right? If it's automated enough. Can you talk about the maturity thing, but then kind of, how does that impact tooling?
So just on the maturity front, actually, I think the industry has come a really long way in terms of maturity. And one of the good indicators of this is the State of DevOps report that Dora and Google do annually. And they have a scale where they talk about elite performers, high performers, medium, low performers. But the rate of growth of people moving from elite performers to year over year has been tremendous. Like I think from 2018 to 2019, it more than doubled the number of companies which were categorized as elite performers in the industry. And I remember back in the day going and checking out Netflix and seeing some of their process, and like they were one of the early companies which embraced DevOps and cloud and like a high level of automation and canary testing and all this stuff. And while they were the kind of leaders at the time, and this was a very new and innovative thing, I think one of the key takeaways for our audience is hopefully that this is now the norm. And when you're looking at getting your next job, or when you're thinking about skills that make you more competitive in the industry, becoming better at security as a developer is really, really important. As Cindy was saying, it's shifted left, right? It's not your CISO, it's not the security team. Like they're not responsible for security at the end of the day. It's really, they enable the developers to do this. And part of the way they enable developers to do this is they provide better visibility. They provide better mechanisms where developers know what open source libraries they're using and what sort of vulnerabilities they are. There are a whole lot of great tools which accomplish this. So I don't want to go too much into specific tools, but there's a whole skill set and area of expertise, I think, for our audience, where really like developers knowing how to address security issues early and kind of be the lead in their team for that is a very important skill set, and that's what's going to land you your next big job.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So we did have a question come in that I think is germane to this point. So Joe, why don't you take this one if you don't mind? So let me just kind of tee it up, right? So from a customer perspective, right? Obviously we want to move faster as developers, right? We want to get, features added. We want to, update, the products that we sell. In some cases, implement, security fixes faster, that kind of thing. But customers, on the other hand, are sometimes loath to want that. They don't, I'll give you an example, right? And I don't know why it's all about C++ today for me. I don't know why that is, but I didn't want to move off of Visual Studio 5 because I knew it so well, and the new one like totally broke my user experience, right? So as a customer, I didn't want to move. Like, how do companies, particularly startup companies, deal with this challenge of they want to accelerate their code, and maybe they're even mature doing it, but they're getting, in doing so, to Stephen's point, but they're getting pushback from their customers who want them to move more slowly. Is that something that you see? How do they deal with that?
Well, certainly, if updates are part of the process and that disrupts people's deployment, then of course that can be a challenge. But I would kind of flip that around and say that more and more people are demanding secure code and updates that are frequent to create enhancements. And I'll just point to kind of one of the most extreme examples, which is even the Department of Defense has a commit to combat in 24 hours kind of initiative, and it's enabled by a lot of the providers today. And the whole idea that you can commit code and it's secure and you can push it out in 24 hours and that, continuous delivery is automated is, a huge benefit for customers. And so, the idea of being able to, make improvements, to do it securely, I think that's the whole promise. And I think your point's a good one, though, which is you have to consider all the stakeholders. It's about alignment. If you're thinking of the CISO and the security kind of teams, they want to be kind of aligned with the development process and not be disruptive to it. So, more and more, it's not, people don't want to bolt on security. They want to build it in. And the same, ultimately is true for customers in that they want to make sure that the code is not going to disrupt their operations and it's not going to break and it's not going to be problematic. But I think that's part of the point. The quality is not compromised here. I mean, going through these automated methods and having sort of those checkpoints built in, helps to protect customers and, pushing out new features, pushing them out in a secure fashion, assuming you're delivering things that are valuable, customers are going to embrace that. And so I think it's just, it's thinking through the process end to end, factoring in stakeholders, making sure there's alignment and good communications, and in so doing, then, you're not going to be disrupting users or customers, and you're going to offer them applications that are secure.
Makes sense. Makes perfect sense. So you touched on this, and well, I think it has been touched on a few times, but this is kind of the elephant in the room, right? And Anders, maybe let me throw this one your way. You're welcome. It's the hardball question is, as a practical matter, what do you need to do from an integration of an existing. A lot of folks have made significant investments in tool set around, security that rely on having a checkpoint, between, say, for example, development and integration, or for example, between integration and, and production staging, right? Where they might do static analysis or whatever at that point. And there's some level of gate there, like a temporal gate. When that goes away, and you start to move toward more of a continuous model, what are the things that a program should do if they're serious about making sure that they do that in a secure way?
Yeah, I'm not so sure that those things go away. They get far more automated, right? I mean, if the gate is, we shall have X% of code coverage in our unit tests, or we shall have no, severity X or above vulnerabilities in any of the libraries we use, you don't need 10 people in a room to look at a spreadsheet to say, yeah, that number is less than 95%, right? You can do that stuff automatically. So you lose nothing by automating those things, and I would argue you gain quite a lot. I think the challenge becomes how do you balance pushing that out? What's the frequency that the business wants you to do things at? And then how do you do it quickly when you need to, i.e. when there's a 0 day or something like that? So, large organizations and most organizations are starting to think in terms of, look, one pipeline may not be enough, right? One of our large financial customers that we work with, they like to talk about, look, we do a risk assessment for a particular deployment. If we're fixing a typo in a help screen, that can take this pipeline that goes a little bit faster, right? If we're pushing out new functionality that requires, training for employees or documentation for customers, that's another pipeline, right? Or if we're pushing out a fix for a 0 day or some really bad vulnerability, that's this pipeline. So as organizations mature, they start to think in terms of risk modeling and risk management and what is it that we're changing and what sorts of gates do we need to jump through. And let's not forget, there are organizations that work in industries where if you don't go through some of these gates and go through some of these steps, you go to jail, right? And that regulated industries have a set of rules that they're mandated to follow. And so the idea of making this completely automated and so on obviously is a little bit in tension with that. But I think the good news is that as an organization gets more mature and better at things like DevOps and continuous integration, continuous testing, continuous delivery, deployment, you get that machine turning much better. You get better at cranking things out, and then you can start to sort of layer out the different kinds of pipelines that you may need for different kinds of deployments that you need to do, so that when the 0 day shows up, boom, an hour later you're remediated, right? Those are the kinds of challenges that organizations face.
Makes sense. Cindy, I want to get your perspective on this, and then we have a question from the audience. So, Cindy, what are your thoughts on this question?
Yeah, one of the things we see as a best practice, particularly in regulated industries, there's a lot of incumbents out there, that are very expensive application security scanning tools. What we found is people generally don't. You don't just stop using those and say, okay, now I'm going to scan everything earlier and the other goes away. Mm-hmm. What we see is more of like a TSA model at the airport, right? So you do this scan of every person that comes through, whether they, look dangerous or not. You scan everybody and you give them all that light scan. And every now and then, either from randomly or for, particular screening or whatever, you do a deeper scan offline with, that's a little bit more thorough. And so if you think about your code that way, if you automate your scanning into the CI pipeline and just every code change gets this scan, think about that as a way to reduce your risk, find vulnerabilities earlier, but then for a compliance standpoint or security standpoint, maybe every major release you do some other scan, or periodically you do some additional scans with your other tools that you have invested in and feel comfortable with. That's something that we see a lot of people doing as a best practice.
That makes perfect sense. So a related question, which I think is kind of a really interesting one, and you both alluded to this, which is that sometimes the same company can have different different tools that drive multiple pipelines, right? So you think about in a big organization, right? They might have autonomous business units, some of which, maybe they use tool set A and one and tool set B in another, or even sometimes, just personal preference or to accommodate a given process. So you see different tooling within different, pipelines. So I guess, Stephen, let me pick on you, I guess, because, you were talking about doing this, for a number of folks and for a long time. Does it matter if it's a different tool set in terms of what Cindy's talking about, adjusting to kind of the new world, or, what if you need to support multiple different tool sets within the same organization? How does that impact you?
Yeah. So, what I would say for tooling in general is I think that most of the vendors which are doing CI/CD tooling, which are doing security products, they cover both a wide variety of the security needs which folks have, and also platforms and deployment. So there's actually quite good coverage in the industry, and I think one of the ways which you can get kind of a higher level view into this is the foundations. Just like the CNCF provides kind of a higher landscape for what's happening in the cloud native space. There's recently was started the Continuous Delivery Foundation, specifically for CI/CD practices, and I think pretty much all of us are involved in either one or both of those foundations. And for folks who are just trying to see the landscape for how different open source projects, different security projects, different CI/CD, either open source or commercial offerings fit into the landscape, that's a really good starting place for where to kind of start your journey. And the other thing, which I wanted to go back and address, because these are both questions from Sriram. So thanks, Sriram, very much for asking questions in the chat. And, other folks should also chime in. He's setting a good example for all of you. So I think he was also wondering about like releases and getting customers to accept it. And I think something that's important to note is even if you have the best continuous delivery and security practices in your business, if you can't effectively deliver and get your customers to adopt those releases, which have the security fixes, you haven't solved the problem. You haven't been effective. And being like raising your maturity level, it both allows you to respond quicker to issues which come in from customers and provide more value to them, but it also helps you to quickly adapt and move towards a SaaS model. So for folks in the audience who are having trouble getting customers to adopt new releases, or there's long test cycles, or basically they're not consuming the latest security patches you're putting out, it might be time to consider a different model for your users. There's a lot of business benefits to going SaaS, but in particular, there's a lot of security benefits because now you can make sure that your customers have the latest version, get the best support, get the best updates, and this allows you to exercise your strengths as now one of the elite performers in the DevOps industry.
Great.
And Ed, if I could, I think Stephen's
go
point
ahead.
there is great on shifting to SaaS and all of that. But going back to the multiple pipelines, a good friend of mine, a guy named Grant Geyer, who was at RSA, head of products for a long time, when they sort of adopted DevOps tools and the like, and I've seen this with a lot of enterprises as well, especially like I think MassMutual has like 30 or 40 different, potential pipelines, and it's very hard to kind of mandate a consistent set of tools. I mean, it's almost silly to mandate it, but you want to encourage, and what they did at RSA, they wanted to encourage the ability for some teams to innovate and to push, if they had unique security requirements or they want to try a different tool as part of their process, they needed to adhere to certain kind of standards, but they could, maybe use an alternative tool than what the rest of the organization's using, and then standardizing that over time based on best practices and what you learn across your teams. It can be a great way to sort of figure out what is best in breed and what works best overall. But, so it kind of raises this governance issue versus this mandate issue. And I think a lot of organizations with multiple pipelines, I think they're best suited if they're allowing the teams to make decisions themselves, as long as they're adhering to kind of overall, approaches. And then after you've kind of proven and see the benefits and the things like that, you can maybe streamline across, pipelines from that perspective as best practices. And I would say security is one of those opportunities, is why I bring it up. Adding in security in ways that don't slow down developers is, kind of a great thing to do. But certainly, it doesn't have to be in every pipeline to start. You can start with one and kind of see the benefits and then push from there. And so if you do have multiple pipelines or multiple software development teams, you don't have to have a strict definition of the pipeline. You want to have standards, but not mandates, because the teams themselves, the whole purpose is to kind of put decisions in their hands and think through things comprehensively, and consider the requirements. And so I think that's a way for information security teams, for CISOs, to become partners, is to help enable some testing of different tools and developing best practices as opposed to tool mandates. And certainly development teams and DevOps teams want to have, decision making over the tools they use, because at the end of the day, it affects their developers.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it almost, I mean, it sounds like, it comes back to kind of this question of, integration, right? Like kind of how do you integrate these processes into, into kind of that, that world. And so I did want to, I did want to come back to something that Cindy said early on, right? When, she was talking about kind of, shift left, right? Because in my mind, and feel free to disagree with me on this, but I kind of see the shift left movement as being, really a story about open source, right? If you look at a lot of the tools that kind of drive our ability to do that, it's built in a lot of ways on open source tools. And as we all know, there are still some companies that, for whatever reason, are resistant to that. Usually not in a development context, but but sometimes it happens. So I'm interested, Cindy, if we can come back to you on kind of this integration point. Is it in fact is open source relevant from a security perspective? Is it something for how should the practitioners hearing us talking about this approach open source from an impact standpoint?
Yeah, open source is certainly an element of it, because if you don't need to reinvent the wheel and there's already some code out there that will accomplish the function that you want, why not reuse it? Plus, it's usually been tested by a wide audience, and so it works. It's two sides of the same coin, though. On the one hand, a lot of people use it, so theoretically it should be more secure. On the other hand, the hackers can access it, so they can see exactly what's going on and how to exploit it. So, I think part of the driver, though, for DevOps is not just open source, but also source code management. I mean, there's basically three big players out there. There's GitLab, GitHub, and Bitbucket as far as source code managers. And what they allow you to do is take what was a monolithic piece of code where you'd have one developer in there working on it because you don't want people clobbering each other with their changes, and now it manages those changes. So you check out a piece of code and it recognizes that you're working on a piece and so-and-so is working on a piece, another person's working on a piece, and it manages those changes. That is really, I think, the biggest driver that has allowed the velocity that we've seen. Dependencies, open source code certainly contributes to that, and will continue to contribute more to that. But I think that source code management was sort of the genesis for it. In terms of the biggest things going forward, people need to make sure that they are considering their software supply chain. So scanning dependencies for vulnerabilities, because once you pull it in, it's yours, and you need to be responsible for it as well. But also, if you're doing cloud native and you're going with containers and Kubernetes and those elements, those all represent new attack surfaces also. In fact, I wrote a book about it last year that was intended for a security audience to think about all the changes that are going on in dev and how that affects security, because it is dependencies, it's APIs, it's all of those elements.
You raise a really interesting point, which is that if you talk to developers, right, about containers, and as a thought experiment, right, if you were to ask developers, like, where do they think in the maturity life cycle containers are, they would probably say, oh, late mainstream, right? Everybody uses that. But if you talk to security people, they have a very different view, right? They would say, oh yeah, no, that's pre-CASM, like nobody's using that, right? And it's just a disconnect between understanding what the developers are doing versus what the security people think that they're doing. So I guess I'm wondering about that. Is it just in the container space, or is there is that, how do we get around that problem? Is it just educating security people, or is it is there something else that we need to do there?
Well, it's a combination of things. It's educating security people, because there are some good container security tools available. But it's also that in some spaces like API security, that's new enough that there's not a plethora of good tools available. So it's a little bit of maturity of what's available to help solve the problem, and maturity of recognizing the attack surfaces.
And if I could add, I think, what goes into your containers is, in fact, source, from source that you're writing. It is from open source, third-party libraries and components. If you look at binary repositories, there's, all sorts of native binaries that are in there that, end up going into containers themselves. And I think, having an inherent or a native way to, harden binaries themselves and all the components that go into containers, and then harden those containers. If that's an automated process, you've really dramatically reduced the attack surface, in a way that isn't slowing down developers. And I do think, whether it's software composition or just being mindful of the versions you're on in open source, there are, potentially any number of vulnerabilities that exist. But the fact is, everybody's code has these open source components in it. You would be hard pressed to find an organization that's not using open source libraries or components in their development. And those things can be easily, mitigated if there's risk in there. And unfortunately, some scanning tools don't even identify all the vulnerabilities in there. So there are known and unknown ones, and detected and undetected ones that are in there. And so I do think it's a problem to address. But I do think open source third-party libraries and components is a natural part of pretty much every development team that's out there, at least in my experience.
So actually, I have a follow-up to that, right? I've been meaning to come back to this because I think you brought it up earlier, and I think it's a really good point, right? This thing about software composition analysis, right? Which, frankly, really everybody should be doing some level of that, right? But as we all know, right, there's still like an education, I think, that needs to happen in the marketplace for a lot of folks to realize that they need to do it. So can you talk about practices to do that, right? So, obviously there's tools and such, but for somebody who may be kind of bootstrapping a process, like, what do you recommend that they look at? Like, is it really just a matter of, using a container scanning engine and, or, finding an open source one or a commercial one or what have you, and applying it to that problem? Or is there more to it than that? And you brought it up, so I'm going to put you on the spot.
Well, I think you ought to ask Anders. Ultimately, I think he's probably got some great background in this area. But no doubt, if you're just getting started, I think it's worthwhile to take a look. Understanding what you're dealing with is a fundamental question, and developers don't like to always recreate the wheel. They do want to use different components, and so understanding that composition and sort of using that to prioritize things going forward. Certainly there's open source tools. Certainly there are commercial tools for composition analysis. And I think, it's another set of tools that's probably, relatively mature from a DevOps perspective for some users, but certainly there's a long ways to go. I think maybe a quarter of users have relatively mature software composition practices or something like that. But I would defer to Anders. Ultimately, I think he's got some good insight on this.
Yeah, Anders, let's take Joe's advice. So you may not be able to see it, but I have the Sonatype did a survey of kind of security practices that are in use, and kind of broke it down by maturity. And one of the things that's kind of the things that they looked at, the least implemented is software composition analysis. But to Joe's point, right, clearly this is something that, we really, as an industry, should be doing more of. Can you just talk about that a little bit? Like, and if you actually, from that data, it's really almost entirely mature shops that are doing that security, that composition analysis piece. What's the impact of that, and what can people do better there?
Yeah, I mean, that's really kind of when I talk about it, I talk about it in terms of what's your software supply chain, right? The same way that you would think about, what's the food supply chain? Where was the food grown? How was it handled? Was it at the right temperature the whole time? So that by the time it shows up on my plate in the restaurant, I'm reasonably sure it's not going to kill me. Assuming I'm allowed to eat in a restaurant one of these days. So thinking about it in terms of the supply chain is one way that I talk about it. I think the other way to think about it is, look, there's really a bill of materials for what goes into your software, right? An electronic bill of materials. There's the code you wrote, there's whatever commercial third-party stuff you use, whatever open source third-party you use. There's the operating environment that you're running in. If you're using things like containers, there's huge benefits for those. I mean, one of the nice things about containers is it makes it easier to be immutable, so that once you put something together, you don't log in and mess around with it again, because that's definitely one of the kind of anti-patterns in the world. So I always encourage people to think in terms of, look, what are the ingredients that go into this? Do you understand the provenance of and trust the provenance of those ingredients? And do you know your bill of materials, so that, for example, when the next zero-day vulnerability gets announced, does it take you 5 minutes to know whether you're using that particular version of that particular library, or does it take you 90 days, as it does in some cases in famous breaches of not so distant past? And I think, knowing what you're operating, knowing what you're running, knowing what the ingredients are is really critical, right? You can throw tools at it, right? You can absolutely, scan to your heart's content and those things, and there's nothing wrong with doing that. The practical aspect of this is you're going to have vulnerabilities in code that's already in production, discovered long after it goes into production. So you need to be able to answer those questions of, do we have this? Do we use this? What do we have to do now? And that's really, software composition analysis. That's, to me, a fancy word of saying, bill of materials and know your supply chain. Whichever phrase you want to use to talk about that. I think that is really important. And John Willis talks a great story about the two different approaches that two companies took to the big Struts vulnerability a few years ago, one being Fannie Mae and the other one being Equifax. And I probably don't need to tell anyone here who did a good job and who didn't. But one of those companies said, look, we got to shut down. We got to shut down public access over the weekend to our systems so that we can figure out where we're vulnerable and then remediate. And the other company, well, they didn't even tell their CISO for 30 days that this vulnerability was known. So you have to have an understanding of what you have in production so that when you need to remediate, because you can't just count on the scanning tools to catch it before you go into production.
And I think one of those acknowledgments, Ed, is that you will have, and I think Anders hit on this, you will have vulnerabilities that get pushed out into production, whether you know them or not. And then, of course, the worst case scenario is you find out after an incident happens, and then you're going back to, kind of figure out, where am I exposed and what happened and all that. But, I do think with that kind of acknowledgement, building in security into your DevOps process can mitigate those known and unknown, vulnerabilities that are in your software supply chain and are in your, software that you deploy to your customer, no matter its source. And there's going to be vulnerabilities no matter what. And I think proactive approaches to, offering runtime protections, for known and unknown vulnerabilities is a key, thing to strive for.
Makes sense. Cindy, you mentioned earlier, so we've talked a lot about, kind of vulnerabilities, and we've talked about, provenance, and so I kind of want to pivot a little bit to come back to, Cindy, what you said earlier about, the configuration piece, right? So it's both the configuration as well as also the vulnerabilities themselves, like, coding errors, for example. So can you just talk about, briefly the configuration side of things, and then, I want to put Stephen on the spot after that with some benefits questions.
Yeah, sure. What code you're using, whether you wrote it or a third party wrote it, is really only part of the equation. The other part of the equation is the settings that are used in a cloud native environment. You've got your cloud service provider, your containers, your orchestrators, all of which have security parameters, and the defaults are not necessarily the most secure. So when you think about how I change those levers, what does a change in one lever do to another? You've got room for misconfiguration. My prediction is, historically it's been patching. Failure to patch has been the biggest reason for exploit. I think in the future, misconfiguration of cloud native environments will be one on par with patching. And so we don't have any good tools right now to help manage across all of those different elements. So that's part of it. And then also to the point made about known and unknown, there have been some good tools out there like fuzz testing that would help identify unknown vulnerabilities. But the problem is they've been very niche. If you can mainstream those sorts of things, we just did an acquisition of a couple of fuzz testing vendors, and we're really intending to make it more mainstream so that the developer has automated tools to find those unknown vulnerabilities just as easily as anything else.
Makes sense. Stephen, I want to come back to you to put you on the spot about this, because it relates to something that you said earlier. We've talked a lot about the security challenges, right? And we teed up some benefits early on. We were talking about the benefits of automation, right? And how that can offer some advantages. I want to make sure, though, that we kind of close that loop, before we kind of talk about the biggest takeaways. Can you talk about, like, in your experience, having done this a long time, is it all just doom and gloom, or, is it really like a mixed bag? Like, how do the benefits relate to, what's the risk reward trade-off here?
Yeah, so I think we've been talking a lot about vulnerabilities, and a couple of folks have mentioned this, that there's, when a vulnerability is identified, you go through multiple steps to remediate it, right? So the first is to identify it itself, to know that you have a vulnerability, and that's hard, right? If you don't have the right tooling, if you don't have the right automation, part of the Equifax issue was they didn't even know that they had a vulnerable server because they thought they'd patched their servers, and they left a couple on the edge, which were not critical servers that folks got into. So identifying that you have a vulnerability is key. The second part is obviously fixing the issue. We talked a lot about open source libraries, and besides, one of the advantages of open source libraries in a security context is you have both a large set of folks who are trying to find exploits, but you also have a very active community who is fixing and patching issues. So the fact, usually when you find a vulnerability in an open source library, there's already a fix available before it's publicly disclosed that there's a vulnerability. Security researchers are quite good at reporting to the original project owners to fix it before they release it to the general public. So usually you have a patch available, and the last step is to deploy it. And I think this is really where the strengths of being a elite performing DevOps team, having good practices, doing continuous updates and continuous deployment helps, because the faster you can get your fix out to your customers, you're minimizing both your customer risk and your own risk as a company. And I think it was maybe Joe gave the example of Fannie Mae shutting down over the weekend, or Andrews gave the example. And maybe it was Andrews who gave the example of Fannie Mae shutting over the weekend for a vulnerability. So that's the right thing to do, but you're impacting your customers if you have to turn off production because your deployment's too slow. So having a quick deployment cycle where you can react, and in the case of the Struts vulnerability, the patch was fixed and posted even before the vulnerability was known in the general public. So you had, as a company, the moment you got the security vulnerability, you had the tools you needed to patch it if you had a fast, continuous integration and continuous deployment cycle.
Makes sense. Okay, so we're just about 3 minutes out, so I want to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to provide kind of closing thoughts. And so to kind of set the stage for this, if briefly, I want to go through, each of you and ask you if there's one or two things, the most important thing that somebody who is hearing us today can walk away with to either, avoid the biggest challenge areas or maximize the biggest security benefits of, kind of moving to a mature, robust, high velocity code release process. So, biggest challenge, or, to be aware of, or biggest benefit to realize. And let's start with Cindy. What do you think there?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is think out of the box. Think beyond just traditional application security tools. Gartner just recognized us in the Magic Quadrant for application security testing, and I think it's very telling that they put a tool that's normally a DevOps tool on the application security testing MQ. So the niche there is, we believe we're really targeted more towards the GitLab users. But think about how you can take advantage of the tools that your developers are already using to embed your security into that and draft off of that momentum.
Makes sense. Anders, your thoughts?
I think get good at turning the crank of your software delivery process. Automate as much as possible. Really look for where the bottlenecks are. Look for ways that you can optimize, because you're going to probably face that scenario where you have a 0 day and you need to react quickly, and you want that to be something that goes through the normal channels as much as possible. If you're continually in kind of panic mode of having to fix vulnerabilities and so on, you need to take a step back and kind of look at your process, understand your supply chain, understand the bill of materials and your operating environments and what go in there. And also, I said this in our chat, but pay attention to social engineering attack vectors and inside issues as well. Not to throw Twitter under the bus, but apparently the big and very significant hack last week was basically somebody got access to the internal admin tools through some apparently spear phishing or something like that. So think in terms of those attack vectors as well. But get good at turning the crank, because the better you are at just continuously delivering your software, whether it goes into production or just up to the threshold, just get good at that, because the day or night when it matters, you don't want to be learning that on the spot. It's a very painful process to go through.
Makes sense. Joe?
Well, I think we're at a very exciting, time, because, DevOps is very mature and people recognize the need for security. And I believe, the high velocity and security don't have to be contradictory. I think they can coexist. And I think the discussion today has proven it, where you've got a variety of tools. You can make decisions about your own process. You're also potentially more aware of your supply chain and all the components that go into your code, because you're working on automating this whole process. And so with that, there's a tremendous opportunity to, I liked how Cindy said it is, think outside the box. This is an opportunity to incrementally improve, but incorporate more and more tools as you go. And it won't slow down your developers. It can accelerate things. And so security and high velocity code release go hand in hand. And I think the most mature companies that are releasing code at high rates also happen to be quite secure. And so what are those best practices? I think it's being mindful, as the others have said, about the tools that you're using in your supply chain, and improving with every stage of your maturity as a DevOps practitioner.
Makes sense. Stephen, briefly, just because we're butting up against the top of the hour.
Yeah, no. So I just want to restate something I said earlier, which I think, especially given COVID and the current pandemic, is even more critical. Is there is both a big risk, because we now have more hackers, more attackers, and we're all doing things remotely. But there's also a huge opportunity if you're doing the right things with helping your to shift to the left with security and do more of the security in the development side. If you're kind of automating faster and deploying faster and setting up your processes so you can respond quickly. I think there's a lot of opportunities, both as companies and as individual developers, to grow your skill set, to grow your career. And the folks who joined us today for the webcast, I think you've all taken the first big step in up-leveling your careers. So thank you for joining us.
Great. Yeah, well, thank you very much. It's been an excellent discussion. Thank you to you all for participating, and thank you to those folks who are attending. Really appreciated having the opportunity to to talk about this important topic with you all. So thank you for joining us, and really appreciated the discussion.
Thank you, Ed.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.